I want to thank Eric W., Linarian, One True Purple, and Khreathor, also known as Khreathor, for their help in this tutorial. I almost forgot to thank NewHouse. He compiled some lighting information that's linked down below. And speaking of which, down below this video, there are some links that you should really check out that give you a lot of the reference that I used for this video. Okay, the basics of lighting. Here we are in the start map. This is an important map to kind of pay attention to. Back in episode 9, I showed you how to load up the original Quake source maps. If you haven't seen that tutorial, I highly recommend you take a look. So in this tutorial, I'm going to stick just to the basic concepts, and I'm going to show you how id lit their maps. We're starting with this basics tutorial, and then I'll have a multi-part series of advanced lighting techniques. Lights are basically point entities, right? And so if we look over here, this particular light has a light value of 250. The default light value is 300. Let's go to this torch over here. Now the difference between these two entities is that the torch has a model that's associated with it, and it also plays a sound effect. This guy is just an invisible light source. I looked around the start map and I couldn't find anything brighter than 500. That doesn't mean it's not here somewhere. So 20 years ago when id Software lit these levels, 500 was basically kind of your starting point for a skylight. Something like a torch would be referred to as a key light. It's a light that's doing heavy lifting, that's lighting a large area. And then you have what's referred to as fill lights. They would use, in this case, a torch with a default of 300 to, illuminate an area. And that's just a default bright light. But this thing would have cast pretty harsh shadows here if there weren't these other lights. So what they've done is they've taken these fill lights, and that one's just kind of sticking out a little bit. And he's about half that amount. He's about 150. It fills in the shadows. Before you start lighting your maps, you should always double check that your gamma is set to 1. Just type gamma in the console and it'll tell you the setting. And if it's not 1, then type gamma space 1 in the console and hit enter. All right, so here we are in game, and you're seeing the map, and it's, there are some dramatic areas of lighting, especially over here in the hard area, and then you've got this kind of hard shadow here. So the important thing to notice is that this is a fairly well lit map. There's not a ton of darkness in it. It's moody. It definitely has some personality to it. There's that 500 light that we saw earlier. There's still a ton of fill lights here and there, especially up here in the rafters, so that it didn't get too dark. So the reason I'm going over the start map so much is that this should be your reference point. When you are lighting your map, every so often go ahead and load up this start map. Your brightest areas, try to match this or get close to it so that your maps aren't too dark. You don't want a map that's too dark. You can err on the side of something being too light, but you cannot recover from having a map that's too dark. Your players won't be able to find their way around. It's not going to look right. All your geometry is kind of going to waste if it's too dark. So light your map, and as you make dramatic changes, compare them against the start map. You'll be very glad that you did. And I'm just talking about lighting values. You can have dramatic shadows. You can have colored lighting. You can have all that stuff. Just make sure that your brightest areas are at least this bright. So here we are in episode 3, map 1. And you can see pretty dramatic lighting. You've got a light style up there. We're going to get to those later. You've got an outdoor area that's pretty well lit. The Doom engine had what was called sector-based lighting, where each little sector of geometry that you built in the engine had one light value. But the beautiful thing about the Quake engine, it uses light maps. So let's take a look at this scene and see what's going on as far as just the light. So you're going to bring down the console. You're going to type r_lightmap1 and hit enter. And that will load up the light map. So try this on levels that you like. It looks like they've got some spotlights working here, all kinds of stuff. So let's actually load up the start map. So if we're looking at this area, you can see those harsh shadows I mentioned, but then you can see that fill light right here. It kind of illuminates that and keeps it from being too harsh. You can see these really beautiful shadows that were cast from a bright light source there. So now moving to TrenchBroom, what I've done is I've made a big box, and it's 512 Quake units on every side, and in the middle of the map is a light. It's just the default light at 300. So you can think of that 300 is kind of a 300 watt bulb. It's not exactly right, but just think of it that way. If I made this 600, this thing would be blown out. So now this is what this looks like in game. The intensity is 300. It's right at the center of a 512 unit cube. But we're going to be able to kind of play with this just by a couple of settings. There are a lot of keys in here, but delay and weight are the two that we're going to be playing with today. So how do you tell weight and delay apart? Well, weight controls the radius of a lighted area, and delay gives you a set of options of how that light fades out. So let's start with weight. So it defaults to 1. I'm going to change it to 0.75. So now you can see when I spawn in, the intensity of the light is basically the same, but the radius of what it covers is much larger. It's expanding out from the middle on all sides, and the lower the weight number, the larger this radius is. So same map, but this light is 300, but it has a weight of 4. So the larger the number, the smaller the radius. I had to take this light and move it up next to the wall to kind of illustrate that. So I use this to kind of highlight armor and, items and things like that. Khreathor also gave me a series of images here that illustrate how the numerical values change the radius of lights. So delay controls the fall off or attenuation of the light, going from its brightest source and then falling off to 0 over a distance. Now it's important to note the delay, the numbers are just kind of choices. It's selecting a preset formula, whereas the values for weight are actual numerical values that you're scaling up and down. A normal point light defaults to a 0 delay, and that is basically what id used in the original maps. They didn't have these tools. So if you set delay 1, you're gonna light a larger area. You can still see kind of a hot spot in the middle there. A delay of 2 has less intensity. It kind of falls off a little more rapidly. Delay 3, there's no fall off, there's no attenuation. Light will go on forever. So be very careful when you're setting delay 3. Delay 4 is similar to delay 3. I can't think of any real practical use for delay 3 or delay 4, but I'm sure there is one. Someone feel free to shout out in the comments. So now delay 5. I use delay 5 lights as fill lights. It's a good, subtle fill light. So all these things work in concert together. What I have here is a graphic that Khreathor made and shared with me. Thanks for that. And we have the weight values going across the top and the row across, and then the columns going down are the delays. So you can see how they work together, and I'll have a link of this graphic down below. You really have to experiment and play with this stuff. So let's say you wanted to highlight a distant button in your map. You would use a weight of 5 and a delay of 2. Now let's add some color. You add a _color key to your light, and then you've got a color picker that comes up, and let's do RGB, right? I've got a red light. Here's my green. Let's do that. So these values are pretty saturated, and we're going to see that in a second. So we have RGB. The light value is 300. The weight is 1, and the delay is 0. Now, in general, my suggestion is to use very desaturated tinted lights. And I learned this from Simon O'Callaghan, otherwise known as Sock, and you might have heard of Arcane Dimensions. And Sock recommends, as do other mappers, that you use colored lights sparingly, but you also kind of make them pastel colors. So I've got a very light blue, powder blue. I have a very light kind of lime green here. Maybe not the best color in the world. And then this is almost like a pink color. Now they almost don't register here on my screen, so I might have overdone it here. Although that blue will be clearly blue in the game. Maybe the red is a little weak. So I'll lower it a bit here. There we go, that's a little more pronounced. So colored lighting really is a matter of taste. In my opinion, less is more when it comes to colored lights. You can do what you want, it's really your prerogative. But I think this works a lot better and gives you a hint of color in your maps as opposed to going crazy with it. And just a reminder that when you use colored lights, you need to include the .lit file that the compilers generate when you release your map. So let's talk about spotlights. Now what I have over here in this corner is a light, and it is targeting an info null. You give the info null a target name. In this case, it's null1. You make the target of the light the info null, null1, and that's going to direct the light upwards. Now, this is the old way of doing it. It's kind of easy. It's a nice way of highlighting items in your map. So you can either target an item with a light, so give the light a target and give the item a target name, or you can use these nulls in order to do that, and you'll see what they look like in a second. These are facing up, And then this spotlight is going down, but it's the same thing. You target an info null, and you could change the orientation of this all you want. It's still going to point at it. So as you can see, there's that one in the center. It's just going straight down. I have these two guys up against the wall, one in a corner and just one on the wall here. And these are up lights. I'm going to move this one and I'm going to raise up the light. I'm going to see how different it looks. You can see the fall off on the light, the attenuation is much more gradual and not so harsh. So you'll need to experiment with the look that you're trying to get, but that's the beauty of lighting. Just have fun with it. So when you're lighting a level, compiling is a very crucial stage, and there are command line options that you can add to the compiling GUI. And so for example, right here, I have soft and extra 4. Those are kind of your final compiling options. So what do those mean? I think a good way to illustrate this is with this spotlight map that we just did. If you can see these little sawtooth edges here, they're actually kind of smooth. So it's easier to see when you turn things off how those settings work. So I'm going to turn these two off, soft and extra, and so we're only running light in its default settings. So if you run these without soft and extra 4 running, you see these stair-step jaggies that are introduced on the light map. And that's the default settings. You don't want that for your final lighting pass. Another attribute of lights are light styles, and that's basically one of the key value pairs up here. And you choose your light style with this drop-down menu here, and you can see these different attributes here. Here's like a bird's eye view of all the different light styles. And what I've done is I've separated these little sections off. And the reason for that is you can't have more than 4 light styles on one face. So I kind of partition these off. And so let's go in order. Style 1 is a short flicker. Style 2 is a slow pulse to and from blackness. Style 3 is a candle, which is kind of a combination of a pulse and a strobe. Style 4 is a seizure-inducing fast strobe. Get out of there. Style 5 is a gentle pulse. Style 6 is a long flicker. Style 7 is Candlelight Variation 2. Style 8 is Candlelight Variation 3. Style 9 is a slow strobe. Style 10 is a fast random flicker. Style 11 is a slow pulse. Now we're going to talk about light entity types. The different class names of light all kind of work the same way. Some have a sprite associated with them, or some have a model and some sound effects added to them. So let's go through those now. So here are the 4 basic light entities that have sound effects and a model. This one is referred to as light flame small white, and this one is light flame small yellow. Now they seem to be identical. The animation's the same, the sound effect's the same. So for all intents and purposes, they're the same. Only id knows for sure why. Then we have our normal torch. This one's called light_torch small wall torch. And then we've got the big guy, light flame large yellow. So more light entities. Now this one's called light_globe, and this was used quite a bit in episode 4 of the original Quake. It's a sprite, but it emanates light. There's no sound effect associated with it. Some of these are invisible, but they do play sound effects. So it's kind of subtle, but you can probably hear a buzzing there. This is a light fluoro spark. You'd use that for a base light that's kind of on the fritz, and you could use a light style with this light and kind of have it sync up and strobing, like in episode 1, map 1. That's it for this episode. Thanks for hanging in there. We'll see you in the next tutorial.